The order came in a little after 9, just as Pearl was rinsing flower stems in the back sink and thinking about closing up. "Don't take your apron off," her boss called from the front of the shop. "We've got a last-minute bridal emergency." Pearl glanced at the clock on the wall. South Street Floral had officially closed 20 minutes ago, and in the rain outside had already turned the windows into gray sheets. "Please tell me it's for tomorrow. It's for tonight." Of course it was. Her boss came through the swinging door with his phone in one hand, and a look on his face that meant the client was rich, angry, or both. Private wedding downtown. A bride rejected the bouquet an hour before the ceremony. Now they want a replacement delivered immediately. White roses, no blush tones, no eucalyptus, no boho nonsense. Their words, not mine. Pearl dried her hands on her apron and took the phone so she could read the notes herself. The order was from the Blackstone Crescent, one of those hotel names people in her neighborhood only said when they were talking about celebrity weddings or political fundraisers. Under the floral details was one short line in all caps: "Hand deliver to bridal party. No delays." Her boss lowered his voice. "They're offering a rush fee and cash on delivery if we get it there in the next 40 minutes. Pearl didn't even pretend to think about it. Her grandmother's prescription refill was due in the morning. The pharmacy had already made it clear they weren't extending another grace period. Pearl still needed groceries too, and she had exactly $26 left in her account until Friday. "I'll take it," she said. The bouquet itself wasn't difficult. Pearl could build something elegant in her sleep. What took time was redoing work someone richer than her had already decided wasn't good enough. She stripped the rejected arrangement apart, kept the stems worth saving, added fresh white garden roses, ranunculus, a tighter collar of stock, and the softest trailing ribbon she could find. By the time she boxed it, the rain had picked up hard enough that the street outside looked half underwater. Her boss helped her into a plastic rain jacket from the supply closet and shoved the delivery slip into her hand. "If they ask, tell them we remade it at no extra labor charge." Pearl gave him a look. "Did we?" "No, but if they're offended enough, maybe they'll tip bigger." 10 minutes later, she was in the florist van, turning downtown through wet traffic with the bouquet box buckled in beside her like a passenger. Chicago at night in the rain had a way of making every light look expensive, even when you were driving with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked if you hit it twice. Pearl kept both hands on the wheel and tried not to think about how late it was getting. She reached the Blackstone Crescent just after 10. The front of the hotel was a mess. Cars lined the curb under the glowing awning. Valets ran back and forth, and black umbrellas moved through the rain like pieces on a board game she didn't understand. Somewhere inside, music was already playing, low and formal, and there were enough white flowers in the lobby windows to make Pearl instantly resent whoever had replaced her arrangement in the first place. She parked in a loading zone she was probably not supposed to use, grabbed the bouquet, and jogged through the rain toward the entrance. A security guard stopped her before she made it inside. "I have a bridal delivery," Pearl said quickly, lifting the box a little. "South Street Floral. It's marked urgent." The guard looked over her shoulder first, toward the line of waiting vehicles, then at the box in her arms. "You're late, I know. I'm trying not to be later." He seemed about to say something else, then someone shouted from farther up the drive, "Where is that bouquet?" Pearl turned instinctively. The guard pointed past her. "Over there." She followed the direction of his hand. A black car had just pulled up a few yards away from the awning, longer than the others, its rear lights glowing red against the wet pavement. A man in a dark coat was waving frantically toward it while talking into a radio. From where Pearl stood, the whole scene looked hurried, private, and badly organized. She looked back at the guard. To the car? He was already looking somewhere else. "That's what I said." Pearl tightened her hold on the bouquet box and moved fast. Rain slapped against the side of her face as she crossed the drive. By the time she reached the car, the back door swung open from the inside. She stopped short, a little confused. She had expected to hand the bouquet through the window or to a wedding coordinator, not climb into somebody's luxury vehicle. But before she could ask, a voice behind her shouted, "Get her in the car! We're out of time!" Pearl turned halfway, expecting someone else to be right behind her. No one was. She looked back at the open door, then at the bouquet in her arms. In her mind, it made just enough sense. Private wedding, last-minute bouquet, rushed transfer. Maybe they were taking the flowers to a private entrance. Or maybe the bride was in another building or parked somewhere off camera for dramatic photos. Wealthy people did strange things around weddings. Pearl had learned that much. So she ducked her head, got into the back seat with the bouquet box, and pulled the door in after her. It shut with a clean, heavy sound. Before she could settle the box beside her, the car started moving. Pearl frowned. "Wait." She reached for the handle. The lock clicked. That was when the wrongness hit her. The back seat was all cream leather and dark wood trim, too polished, too spotless. A silk wrap lay folded beside her. On the opposite seat sat a small white clutch, a crystal bottle of water, and an envelope with a woman's name written across the front in silver ink. Camille. Pearl stared at it. Then she looked up at the dark partition separating her from the driver. "Excuse me," she said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The driver didn't answer. Pearl leaned forward. "Sir?" A calm male voice came through the speaker overhead. "We're already behind schedule, miss." Her stomach dropped. "For what?" "For the ceremony." Pearl looked back at the envelope, then down at the bouquet in her lap, then at the silk wrap. "Oh no," she said under her breath. She hit the partition lightly with the side of her hand. "Stop the car, right now. I'm not the bride." There was a pause. Then, "I was told not to turn back under any circumstances." Pearl's voice rose without her meaning it to. "I'm not asking you to turn back because I'm nervous. I'm telling you I got into the wrong car. I'm the florist. I was delivering the bouquet. Nothing." The city moved outside in wet streaks of gold and red. Pearl pulled at the handle again, even though she knew it wouldn't open. Her heartbeat had started knocking hard now. Less panic than disbelief. This couldn't actually be happening. People didn't just accidentally end up in wedding cars. Not poor girls in wet delivery shoes carrying flowers for women they would never meet. Except apparently they did. She sat back and forced herself to breathe. Think. The delivery slip was still in the pocket of her rain jacket. Her phone too, though it was probably damp. Her boss would be calling any minute if the venue complained, if they even knew she existed yet. Pearl pictured him locking up the shop, heading home, probably assuming she was halfway back already with cash in her pocket. She thought about her grandmother asleep under 2 blankets with the TV on low, and a bottle of cough syrup on the side table, because it was all Pearl could afford until tomorrow. "Please," she said again, quieter this time. "If this goes wrong, I lose my job." The driver answered at last, and for the first time he sounded less certain than before. "Miss, if what you're saying is true, this will be someone else's problem long before it becomes yours." That did not make her feel better. A few minutes later, the car turned through iron gates and onto a private drive lined with lights and trimmed hedges. Ahead of them stood a lakefront estate, so large it barely looked real through the rain. White arrangements framed the entrance. Men in suits stood under the portico with earpieces and radios. Guests in formal wear moved between rooms beyond the tall front windows. The car stopped. Pearl sat frozen for 1 beat too long. Then the door opened. A woman in a headset stepped forward with a smile already in place. Finally. Her smile disappeared the second she saw Pearl. Pearl got out slowly, still holding the bouquet. The woman blinked. "Who are you?" "I'm with the florist." The woman looked into the back seat, as if the real bride might somehow be crouched on the floor. "Where is Camille?" Pearl swallowed. "I think she was supposed to be in this car." 2 more people rushed toward them. One of the security men put a hand to his earpiece. Another opened the front passenger door and looked around in visible confusion. Then, from the top of the front steps, a man in a black tuxedo came down. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Pearl knew his face before she knew his name in that moment. Elias Monroe. She had seen him before in news articles and hotel magazines, always beside some acquisition headline or charity photo, always looking like he had places to be that mattered more than the room he was currently in. Up close, he looked worse for everyone around him. Not angry exactly. Controlled. Which was somehow more dangerous. Someone handed him a phone. He read the screen once, expression unreadable, and handed it back. "She left," he said. The words settled over the front entrance like a temperature drop. A woman near the doorway, older, elegant, pale, made a small broken sound and grabbed the arm of the man beside her. Staff moved toward her immediately. Elias looked at Pearl, not at the bouquet, not at the car, at Pearl. "Who are you?" he asked. "Pearl Bennett, South Street Floral." Her voice sounded embarrassingly small to her own ears. "I brought the replacement bouquet." The guard pointed me toward the car. "Someone yelled to get her in, and I thought they meant me because of the flowers. I didn't know." "No," he said evenly. "You didn't." For a moment, he simply studied her. Then he asked, "Do you have family?" Pearl blinked. "What?" "Anyone who depends on you." "My grandmother." "Is she sick?" Pearl tightened her hold on the bouquet box. "Why are you asking me that?" Elias glanced once toward the older woman being guided into a chair. When he looked back at Pearl, there was still no softness in his face, but there was pressure there now, something hard and immediate beneath the control. "Because my bride is gone," he said. "My guests are already here. My mother cannot survive the humiliation of this wedding collapsing in front of them, and you just stepped out of my wedding car holding the bouquet." Pearl stared at him. Then he said, "I'll cover every medical expense your grandmother has if you walk inside with me and take the bride's place." The rain ticked softly against the stone behind them. Pearl's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. "You can't be serious." "I am. I'm a florist." "Tonight," Elias Monroe said, "you're the only bride I have. And standing there in wet clothes on the front steps of a stranger's wedding, Pearl realized that the worst part of getting into the wrong car wasn't the ride, it was where it had taken her. Pearl's first instinct was to say no, not a polite no, not a hesitant one. A hard, immediate no that would have sent her back down those steps and into the rain, no matter how much money Elias Monroe was offering or how impossible the situation looked from where he stood. But before she could get the word out, the older woman near the doorway swayed again. Two people caught her at once. Someone called for water, someone else called for a doctor. The sudden movement near the entrance pulled everyone's attention for a second, and in that second, Pearl saw something she had not expected to see on Elias Monroe's face. Fear. It was brief, controlled almost as soon as it appeared, but it was there. The woman in the headset moved closer to him. "We can stall another 5 minutes, maybe 10. After that, people are going to start asking questions." "They already are," Elias said. "She's not dressed. She's soaked. We don't even know if—" Elias cut her off with a look. "Do you have a better option?" The woman didn't answer. Pearl tightened her grip on the bouquet box. "This is insane," she said, finally finding her voice again. "You can't ask a stranger to marry you because your fiancé disappeared." "I'm not asking because she disappeared," Elias said. "I'm asking because you're standing here, and there isn't time for anything else. That doesn't make it better." "No," he said. "It doesn't." The honesty in that answer unsettled her more than anger would have. Pearl looked from him to the front doors, where the older woman, his mother, she assumed, was being steadied by a man in a charcoal suit who looked enough like Elias to be family. She looked sick, not dramatic, not fragile in the theatrical way rich people sometimes did when something went wrong for them, genuinely unwell. Elias seemed to follow the direction of her gaze. "My mother's heart condition is not public," he said. "I'd prefer it stayed that way." Pearl looked back at him. "And you think marrying a florist in wet shoes is the better option?" "For tonight, yes." The woman in the headset stepped in before Elias could say more. "If she's going to do this, we need to move. We can't keep the guests waiting any longer." Pearl turned to her. "I haven't agreed." "No," Elias said quietly. "You haven't." He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a phone. A few quick taps. Then he held it out to her. On the screen was the draft of a transfer authorization. A law firm name sat at the top. Then and below it was language Pearl only half understood at first glance, but the number was impossible to miss. $50,000. Her eyes lifted to his. "That clears tonight's panic," he said. "Tomorrow morning my people will handle your grandmother's care properly. Specialists if she needs them. Treatment, medication, transportation. Whatever the doctors say is necessary." Pearl stared at the phone another second, then handed it back. "You think I can be bought. I think you're standing in the rain in a borrowed jacket carrying flowers for people who don't know your name," Elias said. "And I think you would not still be here at this hour unless you needed the money." It landed because it was true. Pearl hated that it was true. Her jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough to understand leverage." The words were cold, but not smug. They were simply factual, and that made them worse. Before Pearl could answer, the older woman near the doorway spoke, her voice weaker than before but clear enough to carry. "Elias." He turned at once. She looked at Pearl with confusion, then at the empty driveway behind the car, as if she still expected another woman to appear and make sense of what she was seeing. "What is happening?" Elias was quiet for one beat too long. Pearl saw the hesitation, saw him choosing between the truth and the version of the truth that would do less damage. It should not have mattered to her. None of this should have mattered to her. But something in that moment, the pressure around him, the whispers, the fact that everyone else seemed to be waiting for him to fix what could not be fixed, hit some soft place in her she wished was harder. She looked down at the bouquet in her hands. Then she said, "If I do this, it ends tonight." Elias turned back toward her. Pearl forced herself to keep going. "You said you'd put everything in writing. You do that first. My grandmother gets real medical care, not promises. And after tonight, you tell me exactly what this marriage is supposed to be." The woman in the headset closed her eyes briefly, like she could not believe this conversation was happening on the front steps of a wedding. Elias, on the other hand, only nodded once. "Done." Pearl drew in a breath that did not help nearly enough. "Then fine." The word was barely out before the woman in the headset grabbed her elbow. "Come with me, now." What followed happened so quickly, Pearl barely had time to process one room before she was being moved into the next. They took her up a private staircase, down a quiet hall, and into a bridal suite that smelled like hairspray, white flowers, and panic. Dresses hung from garment racks. Makeup cases sat open on every surface. A half-empty champagne flute stood near the mirror beside a lipstick-stained napkin and a bridal schedule that had been crossed out so many times it looked attacked. "Shoes off," someone said. Pearl blinked. "What?" "Shoes, jacket. Put the bouquet down." "No, not there. We have 12 minutes. 12 minutes to become somebody else." She should have run then. She thought about it fleetingly, as hands reached for her sleeves, and one of the stylists muttered that the replacement veil was still in the car. But the room was too full, the house too locked down, and the path back to the front door no longer felt like an exit, more like a public collapse she would be standing in the middle of. So Pearl let them work. They didn't try to turn her into the missing woman exactly. That was the strangest part. No one said she had to look like Camille. They only needed her to look bridal enough, distant enough, and expensive enough from across a room full of guests who had come to witness a union, not inspect a face. Someone pinned up her hair properly. Someone else changed her out of the rain jacket and into a fitted white gown that belonged to a woman with a slightly longer torso and a narrower waist. The dress didn't fit perfectly, but the seamstress, working at the speed of a crisis, hid the worst of it in under 3 minutes. Pearl's makeup stayed light, because there wasn't time for much else. A veil went over everything like a final layer of concealment. By the time they turned her toward the mirror, she no longer looked like the delivery girl who had run through Hotel Rain with a bouquet in her arms. She looked like a woman about to make a terrible decision in expensive fabric. The woman in the headset, whose name Pearl finally learned was Danielle, stood behind her and adjusted the veil one last time. "You don't need to say much," she said. "Just follow his lead. Keep your eyes down if you get overwhelmed. Smile when people are looking directly at you. Do not stop walking." Pearl looked at her reflection. "Does he do this often?" Danielle met her eyes in the mirror. "No." That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. A knock came at the door. One of the men outside said, "He's ready." Danielle nodded toward the bouquet. "Take it." Pearl picked it up. Her own work. White roses, clean lines, soft ribbon. It felt absurd that this, of all things, was the most familiar part of the room. Elias was waiting in the hall when she stepped out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He had changed nothing about his expression since downstairs. But now that the immediate chaos had narrowed into this one hallway and this one impossible solution, Pearl saw more clearly what she hadn't had time to before. He was not merely angry about being left. He was furious about being cornered, about losing control in public, about needing a stranger to cover the wound. His eyes moved over her once. Quick and assessing, not admiring, not personal, just checking whether the illusion would hold. "It will do," he said. Pearl almost laughed. "You really know how to make a girl feel special." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. So brief she might have imagined it. Then it was gone. He handed her a pen and a single-page document clipped to a board. "Temporary emergency authorization," he said. "The medical transfer is included. My attorney will finalize the rest tonight." Pearl scanned it. Most of the language blurred, but she found her grandmother's name, the legal promise of immediate financial coverage, and Elias Monroe's signature already at the bottom. She signed. When she gave it back, their fingers almost touched. Both of them noticed. Neither reacted. The ceremony itself blurred and sharpened in turns. Pearl remembered the doors opening, then the sound of guests rising, and she remembered the weight of the veil, the bouquet stems pressing into her palm, the quiet shift in the room as people decided, in real time, to accept what they were being shown. Some faces looked confused, some simply relieved. Most were too trained by money and manners to openly question a powerful family on their own property. Elias stood waiting beneath an arrangement of white orchids and candlelight. Pearl had the sudden, irrational thought that he looked less like a groom than a man about to sign a treaty he did not want. When she reached him, he offered his arm. She took it. The officiant spoke. Pearl heard only parts: vows, trust, partnership, family. She almost wanted to laugh at the cruelty of the language, but the room was too still, and her own nerves sat too close to the surface. When it was time to answer, Elias said his lines without hesitation. His voice was low, steady, practiced. Pearl repeated hers half a beat slower, praying no one noticed the shake in them. Then the rings came. Of course there were rings. A woman Pearl had never met slid one into her hand just before the exchange, and Pearl had to force her fingers to stop trembling long enough to place it where it belonged. Elias did the same with hers, and for the first time that night, she felt something close to fear again, not because of him exactly, but because of the quiet finality of metal against skin. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Applause followed, controlled, elegant, enough to carry the moment across the line. "Is there kissing?" Pearl whispered without moving her lips. "Minimal," Elias said back. It should not have made her want to roll her eyes, but somehow it did. He touched her face only long enough to make the gesture convincing. The kiss itself was brief, cool, and careful. Nothing about it was romantic. Everything about it was strategic. Even so, Pearl felt the room shift around them, as if everyone there had just been handed what they had come to see, and would now stop looking deeper. By the time the photograph started, her cheeks hurt from smiling. She stood where she was placed, sat when she was told, accepted congratulations from strangers who called her beautiful, radiant, lucky. Elias's mother held both of Pearl's hands and kissed her cheek with tears in her eyes. and that was somehow the hardest part of all. "You came," the woman whispered. Pearl didn't know what to say to that, so she only nodded. It was nearly midnight by the time they got away. The drive to Elias's penthouse was silent at first. Pearl sat in the back seat of a different car this time, still in the gown, still wearing the ring, the bouquet long gone somewhere behind her. Chicago slid past the window in cold lights and wet pavement. She felt scraped hollow, not dramatic, not broken, and just emptied out by too much happening too quickly for the mind to catch up. Elias sat across from her, reading something on his phone. He looked as composed as he had before the ceremony, which made Pearl want to dislike him on principle. She turned toward the window and said, "Do you often solve problems like that?" He didn't look up. "No. You did tonight." That made him lift his eyes. "For the record," Pearl said, "I still think this is insane." "It is. Good. I wanted to make sure one of us did." This time he did almost smile, though it vanished before it became one. When the car finally pulled into the underground garage of a luxury high-rise overlooking the lake, Pearl was too tired to feel impressed. A private elevator took them directly upstairs. The apartment it opened into was larger than the entire flower shop and quieter than the clinic waiting room on a Sunday morning. Elias loosened his tie as he crossed the living room, then stopped near the windows and turned back to her. "This arrangement," he said, "will remain private in its details. Publicly, we are married. Privately, we will discuss the terms tomorrow." Pearl stood in the middle of the room, veil still pinned in place, shoes in one hand because she had given up on pretending they didn't hurt an hour ago. "Tomorrow? You need sleep. So do I." She looked down at the ring on her finger. "And tonight?" "Tonight," Elias said, "you get a guest suite and a lock on the door." It was the first thoughtful thing he had said to her all evening, and that annoyed her more than if he had said nothing at all. A woman from the building staff appeared a minute later, silent and efficient, and took Pearl down a hall to a bedroom bigger than the apartment she shared with her grandmother. The dress was removed, the veil finally came out, and someone left a folded t-shirt and soft pants on the bed before closing the door behind her. Pearl stood there alone for a long time after that. Then she went to the bathroom, washed the makeup off her face, and stared at herself in the mirror until the stranger looking back started to resemble her again. When she finally climbed into bed, her body ached from tension and too many hours on her feet. On the nightstand beside her sat a glass bottle of water and a small envelope. Inside was a printed confirmation of the medical transfer for her grandmother. It was real. Pearl sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hand and let that sink in before anything else did. Then she looked down at the ring again. Somewhere in the apartment beyond her door was the man she had married less than 3 hours after meeting. A man who had used her desperation, solved his public crisis, and delivered exactly what he had promised. All in the same night. Pearl lay down at last, but sleep didn't come quickly. She had survived the wedding. Now she had to find out what being Elias Monroe's wife was actually going to cost her. Pearl woke up the next morning with no idea where she was. For one disorienting second, all she registered was soft light, an unfamiliar ceiling, and the fact that her body felt heavier than usual, like sleep had not rested her so much as pinned her down. Then the room came into focus, followed by the dress folded over the chair, the printed medical authorization on the nightstand, and the ring still resting on her hand. She sat up too quickly. Everything from the night before came back in pieces. Rain, the hotel, the car door, Elias Monroe on the front steps, the ceremony, the apartment. None of it felt more real in daylight. If anything, it felt stranger. Her phone was charging on the nightstand. Someone must have brought it in while she was asleep. The screen lit up with 11 missed calls, 3 texts from her boss, and 1 from her neighbor, Mrs. Henson, who checked on Nana Ruth when Pearl worked late. "Your grandma's with 2 nurses and a doctor. They said you sent them. She's scared, but she's okay. Call me when you can." Pearl read that message 3 times before she let herself breathe properly. She called immediately. Mrs. Henson answered on the second ring and launched straight into details. 2 medical staff had arrived at the apartment just after midnight, polite but impossible to argue with. They had assessed Nana Ruth, arranged transportation, and moved her to a private clinic on the north side before dawn. Everything had been handled smoothly enough that even Mrs. Henson, who mistrusted all rich people on principle, sounded half impressed and half suspicious. "They kept calling you Mrs. Monroe," she said finally. Pearl pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Please pretend you didn't hear that." Mrs. Henson was quiet for a second. "Pearl, what exactly happened last night?" Pearl looked down at the ring. "I honestly don't know how to answer that yet." That was the truth, and it stayed with her long after the call ended. An hour later, dressed in jeans and a sweater someone had somehow stalked in the guest closet overnight, Pearl followed the smell of coffee down the hallway and into a kitchen bigger than the flower shop back room where she had spent most of her adult life. The space was all polished stone, dark cabinets, and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake. It should have felt beautiful. Instead, it felt expensive in a way that made warmth seem optional. Elias was already there. He stood at the counter in shirt sleeves, tie loose, one hand around a coffee cup while the other moved across a tablet screen. He looked as controlled as he had the night before, as if he had slept well and woken up in a world where none of this was strange. Pearl stopped in the doorway. "Do you ever look tired?" He glanced up. "Good morning to you too." That wasn't an answer. It wasn't meant to be. There was another cup already poured on the counter, and Pearl hated that he had anticipated her enough to leave it there. She walked over anyway and wrapped both hands around it. More for the heat than the coffee. "My grandmother was moved before sunrise," she said. "You weren't exaggerating. I told you I wouldn't." Pearl studied him for a second. "Why does that make me more nervous?" "Because now you know I keep my word." She let that sit between them before asking the more immediate question, "What happens now?" Elias set his cup down. "Now we define terms. Publicly, we remain married. Privately, this is a controlled arrangement until I decide the risk of undoing it is lower than the risk of maintaining it." Pearl stared at him. That sounded almost human until the last 5 words. He ignored that. "You'll have access to the clinic, transportation if you need it. Financial support has already been set up in your name for immediate expenses. You will not speak to the press, wedding staff, or anyone connected to last night without clearing it first." "And in return?" "In return," Elias said, "you do not disappear, embarrass me, or turn this into something messier than it already is." Pearl took a sip of coffee she didn't really want. "You make marriage sound like witness protection. For now, it's not far off." She wanted to argue, but before she could, a woman entered through a side doorway carrying a tray of cut fruit, and paused when she saw Pearl. She was older, maybe in her 60s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal uniform that somehow managed to look sharper than most office clothes. "Good morning," the woman said. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were assessing. "Would you prefer breakfast in the dining room?" Pearl blinked. "I'm fine here." The woman inclined her head, then addressed Elias. "Your mother called. She would like to see Mrs. Monroe this afternoon." It was the first time anyone had said the name aloud in front of her like it belonged to her. Pearl looked at Elias. "Your mother knows? She knows enough. That sounds dangerous." "It usually is," he said, and went back to his tablet. The woman with the tray gave Pearl a look she couldn't quite read. Not hostility, not warmth, more like caution on behalf of the household itself. Then she left without another word. Pearl waited until the door closed behind her. "You didn't tell me I was moving into a building with staff. You noticed the private elevator and the lake view, but not the staff?" "I was a little distracted by the emergency marriage." A faint, almost invisible shift crossed his face, but it wasn't quite amusement. "I'm leaving in 10 minutes. Someone will take you to the clinic at noon." "Someone? You're not taking the train there." Pearl lifted a brow. "There she is, the control issue." His expression flattened again. "Get used to inconvenience. It's part of surviving proximity to me." She should have found that ridiculous. Instead, she found it irritatingly believable. The first week passed in a pattern Pearl had not expected. She had thought life with Elias Monroe would be dramatic. Constant confrontation, new rules every hour, bodyguards outside every room. Instead, it was quiet in a way that took effort to maintain. Every part of his world seemed designed to run without friction. Doors opened before she reached them. Cars appeared when she was told they would. Appointments were set, confirmed, and waiting. The apartment remained immaculate, no matter how little attention she paid to it. It was the kind of life that made chaos feel impossible, which only made the memory of that wedding night feel more out of place. Pearl saw her grandmother every day. The clinic was private, discreet, and far better than anything she could ever have afforded. Nana Ruth was suspicious of the entire arrangement from the beginning. She was also breathing easier by the 3rd day, which made it difficult for either of them to complain too loudly. Pearl avoided the full truth at first, telling her only that a wealthy client had stepped in after a wedding mix-up and offered help. That explanation lasted until the 2nd afternoon, when Nana Ruth caught sight of the ring. "What did you do?" her grandmother asked. Pearl sat in the chair beside the hospital bed and looked down at her own hand. "Something temporary. That is not an answer." Pearl smiled faintly. "I know." The ring stayed on because Elias had made it clear it needed to. Drivers, nurses, reception staff, the building concierge, everyone already knew her as Mrs. Monroe. Taking it off now would create more questions than she had energy to answer. Back at the apartment, She and Elias moved around each other like two people sharing a hallway in a hotel after a flight delay. Not hostile, not comfortable either. He left early, came back late, took calls in a study with the door half closed, ate little, slept less than he probably needed. Pearl learned these things without trying to. She also learned that he hated unnecessary noise, that he read while standing up when he was irritated, and that no one in the apartment seemed relaxed until he left for the day. That last part bothered her more than she expected. On the fourth afternoon, she went looking for tea and found Elias's mother instead. The older woman, Lenora Monroe, Pearl had finally been told, was sitting alone in the sunroom off the main living area, wrapped in a pale cashmere throw despite the heat. A half-finished cup of tea sat untouched beside her. She looked stronger than she had on the wedding night, but only just. Her face still held that washed-out fragility of someone who had been scared too deeply and recovered too quickly. Pearl hesitated in the doorway. "I can come back." Lenora looked up and smiled faintly. "If you keep doing that, I'll think you dislike me." Pearl stepped farther in. "I don't know you well enough for that. That's fair." Lenora gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." Pearl did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain had returned to the city that afternoon, and soft gray light filled the room without making it gloomy. Lenora folded her hands in her lap and studied Pearl with the same careful intelligence Elias had, only gentler. "You're not who he was supposed to marry," she said at last. Pearl almost laughed at the understatement. "No. Was it his idea?" Pearl thought about lying and decided not to. "Yes." Lenora closed her eyes briefly. Of course it was. Something in the answer surprised Pearl enough that she said, "You don't sound pleased. My son handles pain by turning it into structure, contracts, arrangements, rules. It is exhausting to love a man who thinks control is the same thing as safety." Pearl looked down at the untouched tea. "He did save my grandmother." "Yes," Lenora said quietly. "That would be how he justifies the rest." Pearl had no answer to that. Lenora reached for the cup and failed to hide the slight tremor in her hand. Without thinking, Pearl picked up the teapot and poured fresh tea before the older woman could ask. It was a small thing, but Lenora's expression changed when she noticed. "Thank you," she said. Pearl shrugged. It was getting cold. They ended up talking for nearly 40 minutes. Not about the wedding, not directly. About flowers first, because Lenora noticed the arrangement in the corner had been rebuilt. About the clinic, about Chicago winters, about Pearl's grandmother, and the fact that Nana Ruth did not trust doctors unless they had earned it. By the time footsteps sounded in the hall, the room no longer felt like enemy territory. Elias stopped in the doorway when he saw them. His eyes went first to his mother, then to Pearl, and something unreadable crossed his face. Not irritation exactly, more like surprise that the two of them had found each other without his involvement. Lenora looked up at him. "Your wife has better manners than anyone else in this apartment." Pearl nearly choked on her own tea. Elias's gaze settled on her for a second longer than usual. "That says more about the apartment than it does about her. It says you hire people who are afraid to breathe around you," his mother replied. He did not argue. That night, after Lenora had gone back to her own suite in the adjoining residence downstairs, and the apartment had gone quiet again, Pearl stood at the kitchen counter eating toast because she had forgotten dinner and didn't want to ask anybody where the food lived. Elias came in around 10:30, loosened his cufflinks, and stopped when he saw her. "You're eating bread," he said. Pearl looked down at the plate. "That's an excellent observation." "Why?" "Because it was available." He glanced toward the fridge. "You could have asked someone. For toast? For anything." Pearl set the plate down. "That's the problem with your world, Elias. Everything comes with someone. Someone to pour the coffee, someone to open the door, someone to explain which room I'm allowed to stand in. At some point, it starts to feel easier to just eat bread." He leaned one hand on the counter across from her. "You are allowed to stand in any room you want." "That's generous considering I accidentally married the owner." A silence followed that should have been awkward, and somehow wasn't. Then Elias said more quietly, "My mother likes you." Pearl folded her arms. "Is that a warning?" "No. Good. Because I think she's the first honest person in this building." He looked at her for a long moment after that, and for the first time since the wedding, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like something unresolved. Not trust, not warmth, certainly not love, but something had shifted. And when Pearl went back to her room that night, she realized that the first week had done what the wedding night never could. It had made Elias Monroe real enough to dislike properly, and just human enough to become dangerous in a completely different way. By the second week, Pearl had stopped feeling like a trespasser and started feeling like a witness. It was not the same thing as belonging. Belonging implied comfort, and there was very little of that in Elias Monroe's world, but she was beginning to understand its rhythm. The quiet was not peace, it was discipline. The polished surfaces, the controlled schedules, the staff who moved with careful efficiency. None of it existed to create ease. It existed to prevent disruption. Elias did not like surprises, delays, or emotional messes. He tolerated inconvenience only when it came wrapped in a business suit and delivered useful information. Pearl, by contrast, had entered his life as pure inconvenience. Maybe that was why he kept noticing her, not openly. Elias did very little openly, but she started catching the small things. He no longer looked surprised to see her at breakfast. When she visited Lenora downstairs, he somehow always knew how long she had stayed. Twice, she found books left in the sitting room that looked suspiciously like they had been chosen for someone who knew flowers, old estates, and nothing about private equity. He never mentioned them. She never thanked him. The entire apartment ran on unspoken things. The first public event after the wedding came on a Thursday. Pearl found out about it over coffee when Elias walked into the kitchen at 7:30, already dressed for work, and said, "You're coming with me tonight." She looked up from the clinic notes in front of her. "Good morning to you too." "It's a dinner." That was somehow less helpful. He set his phone on the counter. The Monroe Foundation hosts it every year. Family donors, board members, city people who enjoy hearing themselves talk. You need to be there. Pearl narrowed her eyes. Need? Yes. Because my wife disappearing from public view less than 2 weeks after the wedding would invite curiosity. Pearl closed the folder in front of her. "You make marriage sound like a hostage video." Elias ignored that. "It starts at 7. You don't need to do much. Just stay near me, answer direct questions, and avoid volunteering personal details." "Which personal details?" "All of them." Pearl stared at him. "That's not unsettling at all." He picked up his coffee. "Good, then we're aligned." By noon, 3 garment bags had arrived from a boutique on the Gold Coast, along with a stylist who introduced herself as Mara and looked as though she had once been disappointed by every person she had ever met. Pearl stood in the middle of the guest suite while dresses were unzipped around her like evidence. "I'm not wearing anything strapless," she said immediately. Mara looked at her once and set one bag aside. "I assumed." Pearl blinked. "You did? You carry yourself like someone who doesn't enjoy being displayed." That was uncomfortably accurate. The final choice was a dark green gown with long sleeves, a clean neckline, and a shape elegant enough for the event without looking like it belonged to someone else. It was beautiful in a way Pearl did not trust. She stood in front of the mirror after Mara left, and tried to reconcile the woman in the reflection with the one who still counted grocery totals in her head. When Elias came to the apartment just before 6 to change, he found her standing near the window in the finished dress, with one earring still in her hand. For a second, he said nothing. Pearl looked at him through the mirror. "If you hate it, that's unfortunate. Because I'm not going back downstairs for another round." "I don't hate it." She waited. Then he added, "It suits you." Pearl turned. That sounded painful. "Only because I knew you'd say that." She smiled despite herself, and fixed the second earring into place. Elias had changed into a black suit and tie, simple enough to be severe. He always looked expensive, but tonight there was something sharper in the way he wore it, as if he expected battle dressed as conversation. On the drive there, she asked, "Who exactly am I meeting?" "People with too much money and not enough boundaries." That narrows it down. Board members, donors, a few rival families who pretend the foundation matters more to them than the tax benefits. Pearl glanced at him. "And what matters to you?" He looked out at the city passing beyond the tinted window. Control. At least he was honest. The event took place at one of the Monroe hotels downtown, in a ballroom full of glass, soft lighting, and people who seemed to know exactly where to stand in order to be seen by the right crowd. The moment Elias and Pearl entered, several heads turned. She felt it immediately, that subtle but unmistakable shift in attention. Not shock this time. Assessment. His wife, the replacement bride, the woman from the wedding no one had quite understood but everyone had accepted because Elias Monroe had offered no explanation. Pearl slipped her hand through the crook of his arm because it seemed expected, and because if she didn't have something steady to hold on to, she might turn around and leave. Elias looked down briefly at the contact, then covered her hand once with his own. Oh, it was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it changed the way the room saw them. Possessive, Pearl thought. Convincing, the room probably thought back. The first 20 minutes were exactly as bad as she expected. Men with silver hair and careful smiles shook Elias's hand, while women in expensive silk examined Pearl without appearing to. People asked where they had met, how married life was treating them, and whether they planned to travel soon. Elias answered just enough to close each conversation without opening a new one. Pearl followed his lead and said little. Then, as the dinner crowd thickened, a man in his late 50s with a broad smile and sharp eyes approached them near the champagne station. "Monroe," he said warmly, as if the two of them were old friends rather than something less generous. "You finally decided to show off your wife." Elias's posture posture changed by a degree. It was barely visible, but Pearl felt it where her arm touched his. "Dalton," Elias said. The man turned to Pearl. "I'm Charles Dalton. I've known your husband long enough to remember when he still had the sense to avoid charity dinners." "That sounds like a useful trait," Pearl said. Dalton laughed. "She has opinions. Good. He needs that." Then he looked at Elias again. "You heard the rumor about the waterfront bid?" "I hear a lot of rumors. You should hear this one. Apparently someone's gotten nervous about your environmental review." Elias did not react. "Is that your concern?" "No," Dalton said easily. "But a few people here tonight have started wondering whether your foundation's urban renewal work will be enough to distract from what's happening on the private side." Pearl might not have understood the details, but she understood tone. This was not conversation. It was pressure delivered politely. "I'm sure if Mr. Dalton had something concrete to say," she said, before she could overthink it, "he would say it." Both men looked at her. Dalton smiled wider. "I like her. That makes one of us," Elias said. Pearl ignored him. "My grandmother always said people usually hide bad news inside concern when they're hoping you'll panic for free." For the first time, Dalton's smile faltered. Elias's hand tightened almost imperceptibly over hers. Dalton gave a short laugh. "That is either good advice or a warning. Maybe both," Pearl said. A silence stretched for half a second, just enough to reset the power in the exchange. Then Dalton lifted his glass. "Well, congratulations again." He moved on. Pearl let out a quiet breath through her nose. "Was that bad?" Elias looked at her. "No." "Was it good?" "Yes." That sounded even more painful than the dress comment. He should have let it go there. Instead, after a beat, he said, "Dalton wanted me to ask what he was really hearing. If I had, he would have known I was concerned." Pearl nodded slowly. "So I saved you from sounding worried. You saved me from confirming that he'd landed a hit." She took a sip of champagne she did not want. "I'd like that in writing." "Of course you would." Dinner was announced soon after, and Pearl thought the worst of the evening might already be over. She was wrong. Her place card sat at Elias's right hand near the center of the donor table. Across from them sat a councilwoman Pearl recognized from local news. Beside her, an art museum trustee, and farther down the table, a woman in a deep blue gown who introduced herself as Vivian Mercer, with the effortless confidence of someone used to being remembered. Pearl noticed Elias's expression change by almost nothing when Vivian sat down. Vivian noticed too. That much was obvious from the way her smile sharpened. "Elias," Vivian said, "you look married." Pearl kept her face still. Elias unfolded his napkin. "That would be because I am." Vivian turned to Pearl, gaze cool and polished. "You have my sympathy." Pearl smiled politely. "That seems premature." "I'm still gathering evidence." The councilwoman beside her choked on a laugh and disguised it as a cough. Vivian's smile thinned. The dinner moved in courses and speeches. Pearl learned quickly that foundation events were simply business dinners wearing better manners. Projects were praised, neighborhoods discussed, pledges mentioned casually enough to sound generous rather than strategic. Elias spoke when necessary, and said very little that could be used against him. When others spoke, Pearl watched the room instead. That was how she noticed Vivian leaving her seat between courses, and returning with a smile too bright to be casual. That was also how she noticed the young assistant approaching Elias from behind, just before the keynote address began, envelope in hand. The assistant bent slightly. "Mr. Monroe, this was left for you at reception. They said it was urgent." Elias took it with a frown. Pearl saw the handwriting and knew at once that it was wrong. Not because she recognized it, because it was trying too hard. Elegant, slanted, almost theatrical in a room full of people who already performed wealth for a living. She didn't know why the instinct hit so hard, only that it did. "Don't open that here," she said quietly. Elias glanced at her. The assistant had already stepped away. Around them, guests were turning their attention toward the podium. The room was settling. If Elias opened the note now and reacted badly to whatever was inside, every person at the table would see it. "Why not?" he asked under his breath. Pearl looked once across the room and found Vivian watching them over the rim of her wineglass. "Because someone wants you to." His gaze sharpened. He set the envelope face down beside his plate and did not touch it again until the speeches were over. By the time they got back to the car, the air between them had changed. The city outside was slick with late-night rain, the streets brighter than before because the storm had passed and left everything shining. Neither of them spoke until the car had turned onto Lakeshore Drive. Then Elias said, "How did you know?" Pearl looked at him. "I didn't know. I guessed." "That isn't the same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't." He waited. Pearl folded her hands in her lap. "The man with the rumor wanted you off balance. The woman in blue wanted to get under your skin. Then someone sends a note during the one moment in the evening when the whole room is paying attention to your table. If you opened it and reacted, everyone would see. That felt planned." Elias was quiet for a long time after that. Finally, he said, "It was from Camille." Pearl turned toward him fully. "She wants money in exchange for silence," he said. "And she picked tonight because she assumed I'd break composure in public." Pearl stared for a second. "Your ex-bride is blackmailing you?" "My almost wife," Elias corrected. "And yes," Pearl sank back against the seat. "That's somehow worse." A silence followed, but not an awkward one. More like the silence after a door opened and neither person wanted to be the first to comment on what was behind it. When the car stopped in the underground garage, Elias did not reach for the door immediately. "You were useful tonight," he said instead. Pearl gave him a look. "That is one of the least romantic things anyone has ever said to me." "I wasn't trying to be romantic." "I know. That's the problem." For the first time all evening, he laughed. It was brief, quiet. More surprise than amusement, but it was real. Pearl blinked at him. Elias seemed to realize what he'd done and looked away first. "Get some sleep." She got out of the car before she could say something reckless, but the sound of that laugh followed her into the elevator. Later, alone in her room, Pearl stood at the window in the dark and looked out over the city lights, trying to make sense of what had changed. It wasn't trust. It definitely wasn't safety. Elias Monroe was still a man who treated emotion like a leak in the foundation. He had married her because he needed a solution, not because he wanted her. And yet tonight, for the first time, Pearl had not felt like a prop standing next to him. She had felt like someone he was beginning to see. By the third week, Pearl had stopped counting how many times she had told herself this was temporary. The words still mattered, but it no longer shaped every hour the way it had at first. Life in Elias's apartment had settled into something more dangerous than chaos. Routine. She woke early, checked on her grandmother before noon, spent part of the afternoon with Lenora when the older woman felt strong enough for company, and learned the rest of the building by repetition rather than permission. The staff no longer watched her with the same careful uncertainty. They still treated her with formal respect, but there was less stiffness in it now, less of the quiet question mark that had followed her through those first days. They had realized, one by one, that she was neither fragile nor theatrical, and that she had no interest in throwing her accidental marriage around like a weapon. That mattered in a house like this. It mattered to Elias too, though he never said so directly. What he did instead was smaller and more difficult to ignore. He started asking her things that sounded casual and weren't. Had she eaten? Whether her grandmother's breathing had improved? If the clinic doctor had changed the medication? Once, when he came home just after midnight and found the kitchen light still on, he looked at the half-finished grocery list beside Pearl's cup of tea and said, "Why are you writing down prices?" Pearl looked up from the paper. "Because food costs money. You know there's an account for household expenses." "That doesn't answer my question." He stood there a second longer than necessary, tie loosened, eyes tired in a way the rest of him rarely admitted. "No," he said at last. "I suppose it doesn't." Another night, he came home early enough to catch Lenora laughing in the sitting room over one of Pearl's stories about a funeral arrangement disaster that had involved a peacock feather centerpiece and a groom who fainted before the viewing even began. Elias had stopped in the doorway, listening longer than he probably intended. Pearl noticed because Lenora noticed, and because the room changed slightly whenever he entered it. Not in a bad way, just enough to remind everyone that the axis had shifted. "You should join us," Lenora told him. "I'm working. You're always working." "That has yet to kill me." Lenora gave him a dry look. "That remains to be seen." Pearl expected him to leave. Instead, he came into the room, stood near the fireplace, and listened to the end of the story with his hands in his pockets and an expression that suggested he was trying very hard not to be entertained. It was Lenora who ruined that effort. "He smiled yesterday," she told Pearl, as if Elias were not standing right there. Pearl turned. "Did he?" "Barely," Lenora said. "But I've learned to appreciate limited miracles." Elias exhaled through his nose. "I regret introducing the two of you." "No, you don't," his mother said. He didn't answer, which in that house counted as proof. The strange thing was that Pearl was beginning to understand him even when he said nothing. She knew when a silence meant irritation and when it meant exhaustion. She knew the difference between the look he wore for staff, for business, and for the small handful of people who had earned something more real from him. She also knew he was sleeping badly. It showed in the late hours, the untouched food, the way he sometimes stood at the windows with a drink in his hand, and a stillness too rigid to be restful. The first time she asked if everything was all right, he looked at her as if the question itself were an intrusion. The second time he said, "You're allowed to stop trying to be kind to me." Pearl leaned against the kitchen counter and folded her arms. "You say that like kindness is a trap. With enough practice, it can be." She let the answer sit there a second. "That sounds like somebody disappointed you." A faint change crossed his face, not shock, more like the discomfort of being read correctly by someone he had not intended to let that close. Many people have disappointed me, he said. Pearl almost smiled. That sounds more familiar. He looked down at the papers in his hand. Go to bed, Pearl. She did, but she thought about the way he had said her name for longer than she wanted to admit. The shift that came in the 4th week was less subtle. Pearl returned from the clinic one Thursday afternoon to find the apartment emptier than usual. No low movement from the staff. No quiet music somewhere in the background. The kind of silence that did not belong to a normal day. She had just set her bag down when Marianne, the house manager who had first taken her measure and filed her under temporary complication, came in from the hall. Mrs. Monroe, Marianne said, and for once there was no reserve in her voice, only urgency. Mr. Monroe called. He asked that you stay inside tonight. Pearl straightened. Why? He didn't say. That usually means the answer is bad. Marianne did not disagree. Pearl stood very still for a second. Is Lenora downstairs? In her suite. She's fine. That relieved her enough to let the rest settle in. What happened? I'm not sure. There was a meeting, then a change in security. Pearl looked toward the windows, though there was nothing to see but gray sky and lake light. And he called himself? Yes, that part mattered more than it should have. She spent the next 3 hours pretending to read while hearing every sound in the hallway. At some point the weather turned ugly again. Wind hit the windows in bursts, and rain came hard enough to erase half the view. Pearl made tea she didn't want, sat down, stood up, sat down again. By 9:30 she had convinced herself she was being ridiculous. By 10:15 she was angry enough to stop being scared. When the apartment door finally opened, it was nearly 11. Elias came in first, followed by one of his security men, who stopped just inside the entryway and said, "Doctor's on the way." Pearl was already crossing the room before she had fully registered why. Elias was not bleeding in the dramatic sense. There was no cinematic collapse, no bullet wound, no trail of blood across white marble, but one side of his face was bruised, his lower lip split, and his right hand looked swollen enough to make closing it difficult. His shirt was gone beneath a dark wool coat, and in the t-shirt underneath had rain across the shoulders and something darker near the ribs. Pearl stopped in front of him. What happened? I'm fine, he said. No, you're not. The security man behind him looked relieved that someone else had said it. He was advised not to come home until... Elias cut him off with a look. Leave. The man hesitated. Sir, now. He left. Pearl stared at Elias. You enjoy making people nervous. I enjoy competence. It's just harder to find. He took one step toward the hall and stopped, just briefly, when the movement pulled at whatever injury sat under the coat. That was enough. Pearl moved closer without thinking, hands already lifting toward the lapels. Take it off. Elias looked down at her. Excuse me? Your coat. If you're going to stand there pretending you're fine, at least don't make it harder to prove otherwise. A strange beat passed between them. Then, perhaps because he was too tired to argue properly, Elias shrugged the coat off and handed it to her. The t-shirt underneath was damp and clinging. The stain near his ribs was blood after all, more smeared than fresh, as though somebody had cleaned the worst of it badly or in a hurry. Pearl's anger sharpened immediately. You said you were fine. I am. If that's your version of fine, I'd hate to see serious. The doctor arrived 10 minutes later, a discreet man in his 40s with the kind of face that had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. Pearl stayed while he worked, because Elias did not tell her to leave, and because someone had to hold the flashlight when the doctor cleaned the cut near his side, and muttered about cracked ribs rather than broken ones. The damage, it turned out, had come from a fight that had involved a table edge, a stubborn refusal to go to the hospital, and what the doctor politely called poor judgment under pressure. When the doctor finally left with instructions and medication, the apartment went quiet again. Elias sat at the kitchen island, with one hand braced against the counter, and his shirt discarded somewhere behind him. Bruises were starting to darken across his ribs and shoulder. Up close, stripped of the suit and the cold precision he wore like armor, he looked less like a man in control, and more like a man who had spent too long believing control could keep violence outside his own body. Pearl set a glass of water in front of him. Did someone at least lose teeth? He looked up, tired enough that the corner of his mouth almost shifted. You're assuming I was the injured party and not the cause. You can be both. That's probably true. She stood across from him, arms folded. Was this business? Yes. That means nothing. It means enough. Pearl wanted to push harder. Instead she asked, Are you in real danger? His eyes held hers for a second. Not tonight. It was not the reassurance she would have preferred, but it was the most honest one she was likely to get. She turned away before the look in his face could settle too deeply into her chest. You need food before you take the pain medication. I'm not hungry. That wasn't a question. He watched her move around the kitchen for a moment. You get bossy when you're worried. No, Pearl said, opening cabinets until she found what she needed. I get practical when people are being stupid. And here I thought I was earning sympathy. You were never that lucky. He was quiet after that. Pearl made soup because it was the fastest thing she could think of that didn't require effort from either of them. Nothing fancy, just broth, noodles, herbs, and the last of the roasted chicken Marianne had left in the fridge. While it heated, she became acutely aware of the room behind her, of Elias staying where she had put him, of the silence between them changing shape, of the fact that this was the first time she had seen him without the full architecture of power arranged around him. When she set the bowl down in front of him, he looked at it, then at her. You didn't have to do this. Pearl leaned one hip against the counter. I know. He took a spoonful anyway. She watched his expression shift, just slightly, as the heat reached him. It was not dramatic, not some cinematic revelation, just the body remembering it was exhausted, and the person inside it realizing he was being cared for without having asked. That was somehow worse. Pearl, he said after a minute. Yes? Why are you still being kind to me? It was the first truly unguarded question he had asked her. She looked at him for a long second before answering. Because you're hurt. That isn't enough. Maybe for your world it isn't. He lowered his eyes to the bowl. And for yours? Pearl thought about her grandmother, the clinic, Lenora's tired smile, the way people in her life had survived each other by showing up long before they could afford to. For mine, she said quietly. Sometimes that's where it starts. Something moved in his face then, a small and dangerous in its softness. He looked up at her again, and whatever sat between them after that was no longer the same thing it had been a week ago. Not love, not yet. But trust, perhaps. In its earliest and most inconvenient form. By the time 2 months had passed, the marriage no longer felt like an emergency. That was the problem. At first, Pearl had measured everything against the wedding night. The contract, the apartment, the drivers, the ring, the strange public life she had been pushed into without warning. None of it had seemed built to last. It had felt like a temporary bridge thrown over a collapse. Something to be taken apart once the crisis passed. But bridges were not supposed to become routines. They were not supposed to know what time someone liked their coffee, or which medicine made Lenora sleepy in the afternoon, or how long Elias stood by the windows on nights when something in his world had gone wrong. They were not supposed to start feeling normal. Pearl hated how easily normal had arrived. Her grandmother was stronger now. The clinic had done what money and good doctors usually did when applied early enough and without argument. Nana Ruth had put on a little weight. Her cough had loosened, and she had resumed issuing criticism with enough energy to suggest she intended to live a good while longer. You look tired, she told Pearl one afternoon, watching her peel an orange by the window in the private recovery suite. That's rich, coming from somebody who fought a nurse over salt packets yesterday. I was right about the soup. You were impossible about the soup. Nana Ruth sniffed. So, are you going to keep pretending this is temporary? Pearl looked up. You say that like you know something I don't. I know your face. Her grandmother settled farther back into the pillows. You had that same look when you were 16 and swore you didn't care whether that boy from the bakery called again. Pearl laughed despite herself. This is not the same. No, Nana Ruth said. It isn't. That boy from the bakery couldn't afford decent shoes, and this one clearly can. Pearl dropped the orange peel into a napkin and shook her head. You've met him twice. I only needed once. That should not have unsettled her as much as it did. Elias had been to the clinic more often lately, never for long, never with any theatrical display of concern. He came in after meetings or on the way to somewhere else, spoke quietly with the attending physician, and left only after making sure Pearl's grandmother had what she needed. Nana Ruth liked him in the cautious way older women liked men. They had not yet decided whether to bless or outlive. Pearl didn't know what to do with the fact that he showed up at all. It would have been easier if Elias had stayed what he was in the beginning, controlled, transactional, cold enough to make boundaries simple. Instead, somewhere between the foundation dinner and the night he came home bruised, he had begun letting parts of himself slip through that neither of them seemed fully prepared for. He still worked too much, still treated half his life like classified material, still answered direct emotional questions with the look of a man watching a fire spread toward expensive flooring. But he had changed. He came home earlier when he could. He ate if Pearl was sitting at the counter and ignored food if she wasn't. He started asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with flowers, small things at first, like whether one of Lenora's caregivers was talking too much in the mornings, or whether the apartment felt too cold at night, then larger ones, whether his mother should spend another week in the city or recover at the estate, whether a certain board member's wife struck Pearl as nervous or merely snobbish, whether Dalton's sudden friendliness at the last donor lunch felt genuine. Pearl had stopped asking why he cared what she thought. That answer was becoming too obvious. The trouble was, that Elias seemed to know it too. One Friday evening, he came back from work just before 8 and found Pearl in the dining room surrounded by open floral catalogs and pricing sheets from the shop. South Street Floral had offered to take her back part-time whenever she wanted. Pearl had not decided whether that felt like freedom or disloyalty. Elias loosened his tie as he walked in, paused when he saw the paperwork, and said, "You're thinking about going back?" Pearl looked up. "It's my job." "It was your job." She set the pen down. "That sounds like a distinction rich people invent when they want someone's life to stop moving." His mouth moved slightly at that, not quite a smile. He crossed the room and picked up one of the catalogs. "Do you miss it? The work?" "Yes. The paycheck, definitely. My boss. Only in small doses." Elias leaned one hand on the chair opposite her. "If this is about money, it isn't." He looked at her then, properly. Pearl held his gaze. "I don't want to be kept, Elias." The room went very quiet. He set the catalog down carefully. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think," Pearl said slowly, choosing the words as she went, "that I stepped into a crisis and you built a life around solving it. That life happens to include me. Some days it feels like protection. Some days it feels like a very beautiful cage." He did not react immediately. That was almost worse than anger. When Elias went still like that, it usually meant the truth had landed somewhere inconvenient. Finally he said, "You can leave the apartment whenever you want. That isn't what I meant. I know." Pearl folded her arms and looked away first, because the alternative was saying something she wasn't ready to say. Then maybe stop answering the smaller question. Elias was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You are not here because I pity you, if that's what you're asking." Pearl's eyes returned to him. "Then why am I here?" He looked as if he wanted to answer, really wanted to. But whatever rose in him hit its usual wall before it reached the surface. Elias straightened, the door inside him closing visibly. "Because the situation is still complicated," he said. Pearl stared at him. That was almost honest. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. "You think this is easy for me?" "No," she said, more softly than before. "I think that's exactly the problem." The conversation should have ended there, and maybe it would have if his phone had not buzzed at that exact moment. Elias glanced at the screen, and whatever he saw changed his expression so quickly Pearl felt it before she understood it. "What is it?" she asked. He put the phone face down. "Nothing." Pearl let out a short breath. "You are one of the worst liars I've ever met." "I'm one of the best. I just don't waste the effort on you." That should have sounded arrogant. Instead, it sounded like trust twisted into the wrong shape. He left for the study a minute later. Pearl stayed where she was, staring at the closed catalogs in front of her, and trying not to feel the conversation under her skin. The truth was, she had almost asked him to tell her to stay, not as an arrangement, not as a responsibility, as something else, something far more dangerous. That frightened her enough that she barely slept. 2 nights later, the danger in Elias's world stopped feeling abstract. Pearl had just come back from a late clinic visit when she found Marianne waiting in the entry hall with one of the security men from downstairs. Neither of them looked relieved to see her. "What happened?" Pearl asked immediately. Marianne handed her a phone without answering. It was Elias's, or rather, it had been. The screen was cracked across one corner. On it was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to recognize. Pearl coming out of the clinic that afternoon, alone, coat buttoned, head down, a timestamp in the corner, an unknown number at the top. Below the image was a message. "Wrong wife, still useful." Pearl went cold. Marianne took the phone back gently. "Mr. Monroe intercepted it before you were meant to see it. And where is he now?" "In the garage," said the security man, trying very hard not to come upstairs angrier than he already is. As if summoned by the sentence, the elevator doors opened. Elias stepped out and saw Pearl holding his phone. His expression darkened instantly. "Who gave her that?" "I did," Marianne said before anyone else could answer, "because secrets are not improving the atmosphere in this apartment." For one sharp second, Elias looked ready to argue with all of them. Then he saw Pearl's face properly and stopped. She lifted her chin. "How long?" He did not insult her by pretending not to understand. "Since this afternoon." "And you weren't going to tell me?" "I was handling it." Pearl laughed once, disbelieving. "Of course you were." Elias moved closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough that the others in the room seemed to fade. "You were photographed outside the clinic because someone wants leverage. That does not mean you are in immediate danger. It means I've been part of your danger longer than you admitted." His jaw tightened. Pearl held the broken phone between them. "This is what I mean. Every time I think I'm finally standing on solid ground with you, something reminds me I'm actually standing in the middle of a war I was never told the rules of." Elias took the phone from her hand and set it aside. "I'm telling you now." "No." Pearl said quietly. You're telling me because you ran out of places to hide it. That landed. She saw it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Elias said, more tired than cold, come with me. Pearl almost refused on instinct, but there was something in his voice she had not heard before. Not command, not strategy, weariness. A man reaching the point where holding everything alone was becoming more expensive than letting someone else see it. He took her to the study. For the first time since she had arrived in his life, he did not close the door to shut her out. He closed it because what came next was meant only for her. There were files on the desk, security reports, printed photographs, and one image Pearl recognized immediately, even though she had never seen it before. Camille Rowan leaving O'Hare 2 nights after the wedding, sunglasses on, cap low, getting into a car beside a man Pearl did not know. She didn't just run, Pearl said slowly. No, Elias stood by the desk, one hand braced against the wood. She left with information she was never supposed to have. Since then, she's been trying to sell pieces of it back to people who want leverage over me. Pearl looked from the photo to him. And me? His eyes held hers. You became a public variable, a woman no one expected, which makes you hard to read and easy to threaten. The room was too still. Pearl looked down at the photographs of herself. I should leave. Elias's answer came too fast. No, she lifted her head. Something had slipped. He knew it the second it happened. Pearl saw the awareness in his face, followed immediately by the attempt to pull it back into something safer, more practical, more controlled. But the first answer had already come. No, not because of optics, not because of the contract, not because of public image, because he meant it. Pearl's voice dropped. Why? He looked at her for a long time, all that control returning by visible effort. Because it would not make you safer. It was not enough. They both knew it. But it was the closest either of them had come to the truth, and that made the air between them feel too thin to breathe. Pearl took one step back. You almost said something else. Elias did not deny it, and that frightened her more than the photographs had. After that night in the study, nothing between them was simple again. Not that it had ever been simple. But before, Pearl had at least been able to sort her life into pieces she understood. There was the arrangement. There was her grandmother's care. There was Elias's world, dangerous and private and built on rules she had not agreed to, but had learned to survive. And then there was whatever had been growing between them in the spaces no contract had covered. Now those lines had blurred beyond repair. For the next few days, Elias doubled security without making a show of it. A second car followed the clinic route. The concierge downstairs stopped pretending not to notice when Pearl came and went. Marianne quietly changed the apartment access codes, and 2 names Pearl did not know disappeared from the staff rotation without explanation. Pearl noticed all of it. She also noticed that Elias was home more and speaking less. That should have reassured her. Instead, it made the apartment feel like a room after an argument no one had finished. He moved through it with the same control he brought to everything else, but she could feel strain under the surface now. He was sleeping even less. He took phone calls in the study behind a closed door. Twice she heard his voice rise. Not loudly, but enough to tell her that someone on the other end had crossed a line. Each time he came back out of that room, he looked at her like he wanted to say something, and had already decided not to. Pearl had her own version of that problem. Her grandmother was strong enough to notice when Pearl's smile no longer reached her eyes. You're arguing with him in your head, Nana Ruth said on a Wednesday afternoon, setting down her tea. I can tell. Pearl looked up from the chair beside the bed. That is a strange thing to say to someone. No, it's a familiar thing to say to you. You used to do that with your mother. Pearl was quiet for a second. I'm not arguing with him. You are now, because I challenged you. Her grandmother folded her hands over the blanket. The question is whether you're more angry or more hurt. Pearl stared at the floor. I don't know. That too was honest. Because the truth was, she had stopped being angry about the wedding itself weeks ago. She was angry now, because she had let herself get used to Elias in ways she should not have. Used to his presence, to the way he noticed things before she asked for them, and to the care hidden inside his control, to the increasingly dangerous habit of believing that if it came down to it, he would choose her over whatever strategy he was trying to preserve. And then the photographs had arrived, and his first instinct had still been to manage the threat before telling her it existed. That hurt more than she wanted it to. By the end of the week, the strain finally broke in a way neither of them could pretend not to see. It started with a lunch Pearl had no interest in attending. Elias told her about it over breakfast, his voice flat from too little sleep. There's a board reception at the Grant tomorrow. You're expected. Pearl put her coffee down. Expected by who? By me. That's not the answer you think it is. He looked at her across the kitchen island. Already dressed for work, tie sharp, expression sharper. We don't have the luxury of vanishing right now. Pearl leaned back against the counter. You keep saying we, but somehow all the decisions still sound like yours. His jaw tightened. Because the threats are aimed at my life. And I'm just collateral? That isn't what I said. It's what you keep meaning. A silence dropped between them. Marianne, who had just entered with fresh fruit and the Morning Post, took one look at both of them and quietly retreated without setting anything down. Elias waited until the door closed. "You are not collateral. Then stop treating me like a detail you can position where you need it." His voice stayed low, which somehow made it hit harder. "You think I'm trying to use you?" Pearl laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I think you don't even realize when you're doing it." For the first time in days, anger showed plainly on his face. "That's unfair." "No," she said. "Unfair was handing me a ring and a legal document in the same night and calling it necessary. Unfair was deciding what I could handle without asking me. Unfair is standing there now acting insulted that I noticed." He looked away first, toward the windows, toward the city beyond them. "You noticed because I let you too close." Pearl went very still. When he turned back, the words were already out in the room between them, impossible to take back. Elias seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. Then he did what he always did when something real slipped loose. He reached for distance. "This is exactly why I should have kept boundaries clearer," he said. The sentence landed like a slap. Pearl stared at him. "I'm sorry." His expression shut down by degrees, each one more devastating than the last. "You asked what this is. It's a complication, one I should have managed better." There it was, not the whole truth, maybe. Perhaps not even the truth he meant, but it was the truth he chose to say, and that was enough. Pearl felt something inside her go cold and steady. "A complication," she repeated. Elias exhaled, as if he could hear how wrong it sounded, and had committed to it anyway. "Pearl, no," she said quietly. "Don't fix it now." He stopped. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then Pearl picked up her cup, realized her hand was shaking, and set it back down before she dropped it. "You know what the worst part is?" Elias said nothing. "I almost believed you when you said no." His eyes lifted sharply to hers. Pearl held his gaze. "That night in the study, when I said I should leave, something flickered across his face. Something too late, too raw, too close to apology. But she had already stepped back. By the time he spoke, his voice was quieter. "You're twisting this." "No," Pearl said. "I finally understand it." She left the kitchen before he could answer, and if he followed, she did not hear him. The apartment felt different after that. Not hostile, not loud, just finished. Pearl spent the day at the clinic, then the evening in the guest room with the door locked and her phone face down beside her. Elias called once. She did not answer. Marianne knocked gently around 8 to ask whether she wanted dinner. Pearl said no to that too. She cried only once, and she hated herself for it. Not because of pride, because it proved he had mattered in exactly the way she had tried not to let happen. The next morning, she made a decision before she could unmake it. She visited her grandmother first. Nana Ruth took one look at her face and did not bother with softness. "You're leaving." Pearl sat in the chair by the bed and stared at her hands. For a while. "That man said something stupid." Pearl let out a breath that might have become a laugh in another life. "That obvious?" "Pearl, men with power almost always say something stupid when they're scared." She looked up. "You think he's scared?" "I think," her grandmother said dryly, "that if he wasn't, you wouldn't be." That nearly undid her. Pearl stood and went to the window because she could not bear to answer from the chair. "I can't stay there if I don't know what I am to him." "And what are you to yourself?" The question caught her off guard. Nana Ruth's voice softened only slightly. "If you leave because you're protecting your dignity, that's one thing. If you leave because you're waiting for him to prove your worth, that's another. Know the difference before you pack a bag." Pearl closed her eyes. By the time she returned to the apartment, the answer had settled enough to move her feet. She packed lightly. It did not take long. Most of what she had in Elias's apartment had been bought for convenience rather than chosen. The few things that felt like hers, books, her grandmother's knitted cardigan, the notebook where she still wrote flower orders and grocery sums out of habit, fit into one duffel and a canvas tote. She took off the ring last. For a moment, she simply stood with it in her hand, staring down at the pale indentation it had left on her finger. The mark was small, almost nothing. It still made her chest hurt. She set it on the desk in the guest room beside a note she rewrote 3 times before she let herself stop. It was not dramatic. She refused to give him that. "Elias, I'm not leaving because I'm afraid of your world. I'm leaving because I finally understand what place you meant for me inside it. You were right about one thing. I am a complication, but I won't stay where I'm only welcome as long as I'm useful, manageable, or quiet. My grandmother is stable enough now that I can make other arrangements. Don't interfere with her care. I won't insult either of us by pretending I can repay what you've done for her. But I won't let gratitude become another kind of debt. You don't owe me an explanation. I think if you had one you wanted to give, I would have heard it by now." Pearl, she folded the page once and left it under the ring. Then she walked out. No one stopped her. Marianne found her in the hallway, took in the bag, and closed her eyes briefly as if she had expected this and hoped to be wrong. "Do you want me to call a car?" Pearl shook her head. No, I'd rather leave like a person. Marianne nodded once. I won't tell him until you're gone. Pearl looked at her in surprise. The older woman's expression stayed composed. Sometimes dignity deserves a head start. Pearl almost thanked her and didn't trust her voice enough to risk it. She took the train south with her duffel at her feet, and rain beginning again at the windows. The city moved past in familiar sections she had not realized she missed until she saw them. Convenience stores with flickering signs, apartment buildings with laundry hanging in the back, the kind of life where people opened their own doors and nobody called ahead to announce a visit. She did not go back to the apartment above the laundromat. Too obvious, too easy to find. Instead, she went to the flower market district where South Street Floral sourced half its stock. Her boss swore under his breath when he saw her in the doorway of the warehouse office, and then pulled her into a hug before either of them acknowledged that he had done it. I assume, he said, stepping back, and that this means your weird rich person situation exploded. Pearl let out a tired breath. Something like that. He studied her for a second, then nodded. You can take the spare room over the loading bay for as long as you need. It still smells like carnations and bad decisions, but it's yours if you want it. That did it. Pearl laughed and cried at the same time, which was humiliating and somehow also a relief. By nightfall she had a cot, a blanket, and enough distance to breathe. At the penthouse, Elias came home just after 8. He knew something was wrong before he entered the apartment fully. It was in the silence, not the normal kind, not the disciplined hush his world preferred, but an absence with shape to it. Marianne stepped into the foyer before he could ask, and held out the note without a word. He took it, read it once, then went completely still. Where is she? He asked. Marianne answered carefully. Gone. He looked up. That is not an answer. It's the only one I have that won't make this worse. Something in his face changed then. Not anger first, but disbelief. As if some part of him had still assumed Pearl would cool down, would stay, would wait for him to say the thing he had not known how to say that morning. He moved past Marianne, through the apartment, to the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was open. The closet was partly empty. The ring lay on the desk where Pearl had left it, bright and final against the paper. Elias picked it up. For a long time he stood there holding something that suddenly felt much heavier than gold should. When he came back into the hallway, the disbelief had burned off into something worse. Get me, everyone, he said. Marianne had known him too long to ask who that meant. The next 2 hours fractured into calls, security reports, camera pulls, and names. Elias moved through it all with the kind of cold precision people mistook for calm. And it wasn't calm. It was restraint under maximum pressure. And everyone in the apartment knew it. Pearl had not gone to the clinic. She had not gone back to the old apartment. She had taken the train, switched lines once, and vanished into the city before anyone realized she meant it. By midnight, Elias stood alone in the study with the photograph of Pearl outside the clinic on his desk, and her note open beside it. Complication. He said the word aloud once, and hated the sound of it. Because the truth, stripped of ego and fear and every stupid instinct that had made him pull away at exactly the wrong moment, was much simpler than the language he had chosen. Pearl had become the only part of his life that no longer felt like strategy, and now she was gone. Elias did not sleep that night. By morning, the city had already been divided into zones in his head. Places Pearl would avoid, places she might trust, places she would go only if she needed work, privacy, or both. He had enough people to cover all of Chicago twice over. And for the first hour after sunrise, he used them exactly the way she would have expected him to. Quiet searches, discreet calls, names pulled from transit footage, favors collected from men who owed him more than money. By noon, he stopped. It was not because the search had failed. It was because, standing in the middle of his office with Pearl's note folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, he finally understood what his mother had tried to explain to him years ago, and what Pearl had forced him to face without ever meaning to. Some things could not be managed into staying. If he wanted her back, he would have to go to her as himself, not as the man who arranged outcomes and called them solutions. Lenora looked at him over tea that afternoon and said, "You've finally stopped thinking like your father." He stood by the window, tie undone, fatigue written more plainly on him than he would have allowed in any boardroom. "That sounds optimistic." "It sounds late," she said. "But not too late, if you stop wasting time." He looked at her. "You think she'll see me?" Lenora lifted one shoulder. "That depends. Will she be meeting my son, or the man who keeps trying to negotiate with his own heart?" He almost smiled at that, but not quite. You've been waiting to say something cruel all day. No, his mother said calmly. Cruel would have been saying nothing and letting you continue pretending this is about pride. It was not about pride, not anymore. That was how, a little after 4, Elias Monroe found himself standing in a wholesale flower market on the west side in a charcoal coat that cost more than most men there made in a month, trying not to look like a man who had no business being there, and failing completely. The market was half warehouse, half neighborhood institution. The concrete floors were damp in places, the air cool with refrigeration and wet stems, and the whole building smelled like roses, carnations, greenery, and the faint metallic edge of water in buckets. Men pushed flat carts loaded with boxes down the aisles. Someone in the back was arguing over a shipment from Milwaukee. Nobody stopped what they were doing for long, but plenty of people looked twice. Pearl was at the far end of the warehouse, near a folding table covered in loose stems and ribbon clippings. She wasn't dressed like Mrs. Monroe. She wasn't dressed like the accidental bride from the wedding photos that still hadn't entirely disappeared from certain circles. She was wearing jeans, a dark sweater, work gloves tucked into the back pocket, and a green apron tied around her waist. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, and there was a smudge of leaf stain near one wrist. She was sorting white stock into bunches with the fast, sure movements of someone who knew exactly what to do with her hands when the rest of life made no sense. For one strange second, Elias simply stood there and watched her. This was what she looked like in her own world. Not borrowed. Not positioned beside him for someone else's comfort. Not softened by wealth, polished by staff, or constrained by his life. Just Pearl. She felt him before she saw him. Her hands slowed on the stems. Then she looked up. Whatever expression had been on her face before he arrived disappeared so completely that he almost preferred anger. Anger would have meant he still knew what shape her hurt had taken. This was harder. Controlled, guarded, a woman who had spent several days remembering how to stand inside herself again. She pulled off one glove finger by finger and set it on the table. You found me? I did. Pearl glanced once toward the office mezzanine above the warehouse, then back at him. Did you use your people for that, or just your money? A little of both, he said honestly. Then I stopped. Her brows lifted. Why? Because if I'd kept going that way, I would have reached you as the same man who made you leave. She stared at him for a long moment, and he let her. Around them, the noise of the market continued. Someone laughed too loudly near the loading doors. A radio played low from somewhere overhead. It was almost offensively normal, and Elias was grateful for it. This conversation did not need a dramatic silence around it. It only needed the truth. And that was difficult enough. Pearl folded her arms. What exactly do you want, Elias? He took a breath. There were a dozen versions of this conversation he could have controlled in a boardroom, a courtroom, a negotiation table, or under armed pressure. But standing in front of Pearl in a flower market, with rain-dark daylight filtering through warehouse windows and cold concrete under his shoes, there was only one way to do it that mattered. I came to apologize. The answer landed. He saw it in the small shift of her mouth, the brief uncertainty in her eyes. She had expected persuasion, strategy maybe, explanation built to lead her somewhere, not that. Pearl's voice was quiet. For which part? For saying the ugliest version of the truth, because it was easier than saying the real one. She looked at him steadily. And what was the real one? Elias reached into his coat, pulled out the folded note she had left behind, and looked down at it for a second, before returning his gaze to hers. You asked me once why you were there. I told you it was complicated. Then, when I had the chance to answer properly, I called you a complication. A line of pain crossed her face so quickly he might have missed it if he had not been looking only at her. He kept going. You were never that. The situation was. The timing was. My life is. But you... He stopped, not for effect, but because the next words had never been easy for him, and he had promised himself he would not hide inside difficulty again. You became the only part of it that felt honest. The market seemed to narrow around them. Pearl's eyes did not leave his face. That's not the same thing as love. No, Elias said. It isn't. He took one step closer, careful, slow enough that she could step back if she wanted. It's what came before I knew the word would cost me something. After that, I did what I always do. I tried to contain it, name it badly, reduce it to something I could survive. You saw through that faster than I did. Pearl looked away for the first time, toward the flowers spread across the table between them. You hurt me. The sentence was simple, which made it impossible to defend against. I know. You made me feel like I had imagined all of it. Every change, every moment, every time I thought maybe you were looking at me and not the arrangement. Elias felt that in the center of his chest. You did not imagine it. Pearl let out a breath that shook at the edges. Then why didn't you say it? Because I am worse at this than I am at anything else that matters, he thought. What he said was, because wanting you made me vulnerable in a way I could not control. And instead of telling you that, I reach for the language that had protected me my whole life. Pearl gave a short, humorless laugh. Control. Yes. And what now? Now, Elias said. I stop asking you to live inside my fear. She finally looked back at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat again and pulled out the ring. Not dramatically. Not kneeling in wet concrete. Not turning the market into a performance. He just opened his hand between them and let her see it. I am not here to tell you I can suddenly become easy, he said. I can't. My life is still complicated. It is still dangerous in ways you understand better now than you should have had to. But I am here to tell you that I was wrong about what you are in it. Pearl's eyes dropped to the ring, then lifted again. You were not the substitute who solved my problem, he said quietly. You were the woman who made me realize I no longer wanted the life I had built, if it meant living it without you. For the first time since he arrived, her expression fully broke. Not into tears, not into forgiveness, into something rawer than both. Belief, fighting with hurt. Love refusing to die where pride had tried to bury it. Elias did not move. I don't need you to come back because I asked, he said. I don't need gratitude. I don't need loyalty earned through debt. I need you to choose with full knowledge of who I am, or walk away with none of my people following you and none of my power trying to turn that into a different answer. Pearl's throat moved as she swallowed. You'd let me go? The question cost him more than she would ever know. If that was what you wanted, he said. Yes. She stared at him a long time after that. Then slowly she took off the apron, folded it once, and set it on the table. I hated you for 3 days, she said. That seems low. I'm not finished. He nodded once. I also missed you in ways I deeply resent. Her mouth trembled on the edge of a smile and pain at once. And if that ever happens again, if you ever decide to protect yourself by tearing me down in the process, I will leave so fast you won't even get this speech. You won't need to. That was not permission to sound confident. This time his smile did come. Small, tired, real. Noted. Pearl looked at the ring in his hand again, then at him. And my work? Elias blinked. Your work? I'm not moving back into that apartment to become decorative. A laugh escaped him then, quiet and genuine. I would never survive that version of you. Good. You can work wherever you want, Pearl. The florist, your own studio, a market stall, all of Chicago if you decide flowers should answer to you. I don't care where. I only care that no version of your life asks you to shrink for mine. That was the moment. He knew it because something in her face softened, not out of pity, not out of surrender, but recognition, not of perfection, of effort, of truth, finally arriving without armor. Pearl stepped closer until only the edge of the table sat between them. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You really are terrible at this. I know, but better than before. I'm trying. She looked down once, then held out her hand, not for the ring immediately, for him. Elias took it with a care that would have embarrassed him in any other room. Then, when she nodded, he slid the ring back onto her finger. No audience, no officiant, no crisis, no borrowed veil, just cold flower market air, wet concrete, and a choice made in daylight. Pearl looked at the ring for 1 second, and then up at him. You still have a lot to make up for. I assumed as much. And I'm keeping my apartment key at the market office. That feels ominous. It's called self-respect. That too. She laughed softly then, and the sound went through him like relief after months of holding breath. Elias touched her face only when it was clear she wanted him to. His hand rested against her cheek, warm and careful, like he knew exactly how badly he had almost lost this, and had no intention of pretending otherwise again. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the first time. No witnesses, no strategy, no performance, just Elias and Pearl, and the quiet, impossible fact that the wrong car, the wrong night, and the wrong beginning had led them here anyway. 5 months later, the flowers at the Monroe estate were done entirely by Pearl's studio. Not because Elias had asked, because she had chosen it. She still kept part of her week at the market, and part of it with private clients she preferred over his. Her grandmother was home now. Stronger, louder, and endlessly opinionated from the best chair in the sunniest room of the house they had helped her choose. Lenora visited often, usually under the excuse of tea, and almost never for that alone. Elias was still Elias, still difficult, still private, still too familiar with control, but no longer cruel when afraid, and no longer arrogant enough to mistake silence for strength. On the morning of the real ceremony, Pearl stood in the garden with clipping shears in one hand, and white roses open across the table in front of her. There would be no emergency vows this time. No missing bride. No arrangement built out of pressure. She had designed every piece herself, from the arch to the table flowers, to the small wild arrangement Lenora wanted near the front, because, as she had said with dry certainty, Even proper weddings need a little imperfection if they're going to last. Pearl smiled to herself as she adjusted the last stem. When Elias came up behind her, he slipped a hand around her waist and rested his chin lightly against her temple. "You know," he said, "this is a much better story than the first wedding." Pearl leaned back into him, smiling. "That's because this one starts with the truth. And for once, neither of them had to borrow anything to make it beautiful."